How did you get started in this field? 'Cause you came from law, right?
Right.
How did you get into the brain?
Well, I am a lawyer still. My last bio class was in 10th grade when we couldn't spell DNA. Ultimately, the story starts with marrying a doctor, but I started teaching health law, and then I got interested in law and genetics. About 10 years ago, I was invited to a workshop to talk about where neuroscience was going in the next 25 years and what the ethical and legal issues were around neuroscience. I'd never been involved in it before, but it fascinated me, and my genetics work had some similarities. So I started with the things that I saw happening in genetics and looked to see how are those going to happen in neuroscience. And once I learned a little bit about it, I got hooked. Because the brain makes our minds, and our minds are what the law cares about. Our minds are what we care about. We care a little bit about other people's bodies, but we mainly care about their minds, and the mind is made by the brain. So as we understand more about the brain and how it makes the mind, and how it can be changed in ways to change how people think, and how we can predict people's future behavior by knowing about the brain, that'll change many things in our society and our relations with each other. It'll change an awful lot about the law.
How will it change the law? Is it going to change the people's understanding of the brain first, and then they'll change the law? Or are you going to do you think that lawmakers are going to get the idea first?
So I don't think lawmakers are going to get the idea first. I think we'll see, and we are beginning to see, cases come up in the courts where counsel are making innovative arguments based on the brain, and also where there are new things happen because of what we know about the brain. So for example, one of the things that isn't very obvious, but I think may be important, we're probably very close to being able to predict of people, say 55 and older, who's going to get Alzheimer's disease and who isn't, with maybe 90% accuracy. Now, I'm about to turn 60. Would I want that test? Probably not, but maybe. Would I want my employer to know my test results? Would I want my insurers to know my test results? Would I want my kids to know my test results? I don't know. But to the extent we can predict better who's going to get this terrible neurological disease, if we can do something about it, that's wonderful. If we can't do something about it, there are pluses and there are minuses. So one area in which neuroscience will change us is being able to predict people. Who's going to get Alzheimer's? Which teenager is going to get schizophrenia? Which 12-year-old boy is going to turn out to be a psychopath? Those are the kinds of things that once we can make predictions, we as a society will have to decide, what do we want to do with that information? Do we want the president to, in picking Supreme Court justices, decide based in part on who's going to get Alzheimer's and who isn't? Do we want, if we've got 12-year-old boys that we think are going to be psychopaths, do we throw them in jail and throw away the key? Do we warn the neighbors? Do we put a GPS bracelet on them? If we've got the ability to answer those questions, the next problem will be, how do we want to do it? So I think one big area for law and neuroscience will be predicting who's going to get sick. That's not directly a legal problem, but that will then spin off legal issues around discrimination and guardianship and so on, and predicting who's going to misbehave. And that will be a direct legal issue, both before a crime is committed, but I think more fundamentally in sentencing. If you could say, with the help of a brain scan, this guy is likely to commit the crime again, this guy is not likely to commit the crime again, it changes our sentencing.
And the likelihood seems to be an important question, because let's say they can predict it at 90 or 95% accuracy. You're dealing not with a crowd of people. In the courtroom, you're dealing with one person. And should that person be subjected to being categorized when he might be actually in the 5% area? So that sounds like what the first thing that's going to happen is a tremendous debate about neuroscience.
I think that's right. First, we've got to establish that we can predict it even at a group level. And we're at the beginning of that. One thing that's happened in the last 10 years while I've been following the field has been that our ability to predict things has gotten better because of improved statistical methods. These new black box statistical methods, the machine learning algorithms and so on, are putting forth answers with an accuracy that surprises the researchers. I've had several of my friends call me up and say, you won't believe what accuracy we got using this new statistical
Can you give me an
method.
example of that? That sounds really interesting.
Well, so for example, Anthony Wagner, whom I think you met, has done this work on being able to tell whether somebody remembers something or not, whether they recognize something or not. And using the previous methods of statistical analysis, he was getting 50, 60% accuracy. He went to the machine learning algorithm and was getting 85, 86, 87% accuracy. The experiment was the same, the brains were the same, the statistical methods for teasing the signal out of the noise had changed. Just in the space of the last 10 years.
And that's verifiable experimentally? I mean,
Yes.
not just numbers that don't tell you more than the numbers.
Well,
I'm just so afraid of buying a derivative that nobody understands.
No, and that's fair. And I do think, so one thing I like to say is there are now something like 4,500 fMRI articles published every year in the peer-reviewed literature. And probably more than half of them are wrong. Not because it's fraud, not because they're bad scientists, but because you're at new frontier science, and lots of frontier science goes wrong. And we have to be aware of that. So I think with any of this stuff, you really have to ask two questions. You first have to ask, does it work? How well does it work? How do we know that it works? How confident are we that it works? And then, if you decide it works, how do we want to use it? So if, for example, we could say 95% likely that this kid is going to commit crime again. Are we sure that 95%? How good is that 95%? Does it apply to kids like this kid? Does it apply to left-handed kids? I'm left-handed in part, and I take some solace from the fact that almost all the experiments are done on right-handed people. It's because
because left-handed people are mostly guilty.
No, it's because we're superior and we manage to avoid it. But does it work on lefties? Does it work on kids with this kind of history?
Right.
Does it work on people who had a head trauma in their youth? Those questions, does it work, will be an important question. And then we'll have to ask, how do we want to use it? And one of those questions will be, out of 100 people, 95% will commit the crime again. But what does that tell us about this one person? We can't.
What could you bring to bear in terms of therapy on that person that might edge him into the 5%?
And actually, that's another area where I think neuroscience is really going to affect the law. We're going to learn how to intervene to treat people's brains in ways that change their behavior. I mean, we do that to some extent now through therapy. Even prison is supposed to, in theory, change people's behavior. I think it changes it not in the ways we like. But there have been a couple peer-reviewed studies of people curing opiate addiction with neurosurgery. So one Chinese group burned out the areas of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and in an English language peer-reviewed journal reported that their experimental subjects, soldiers in the People's Liberation Army, no longer craved opium. They did not report what else they no longer craved.
They ate cockroaches. What did they crave?
We don't know. Probably nothing, actually.
Just sat there.
But we don't know because the report didn't do it. But that's a brain intervention that changes a behavior. It cures addiction. It has probably some serious side effects. What about other brain interventions that will turn out to work better? We do this some in a very primitive way with pills now. We do it in a somewhat more sophisticated way with deep brain stimulation for things like Parkinson's disease. That's been well accepted, FDA approved for almost 15 years now, that works. As we learn more about this, maybe we'll figure out a way to cure someone of criminal tendencies through a neuroscience intervention. If that works, then we get the next question, how do we use it? Should a judge be able to say, all right, you're guilty, I sentence you to neurosurgery? Or say, you have a choice, free choice, doesn't matter to me, you can take 20 years in prison, or you can take neurosurgery. Do we allow that, or don't we?
More debate, right? That is calling up more debate. Is it coerced surgery or not?
People doing the sort of thing I do are not going to run out of things to talk about anytime soon.
So neuroscience will probably affect sentencing in terms of therapy. Will it affect sentencing, do you think, in terms of the kind of sentence a person gets. If the judge says, for instance, well, his brain wasn't fully developed, he was really still
So that's another
kid.
great area. It already has to some extent.
Yes.
The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that you can't execute people for crimes they committed before they were 16 on the grounds that it's cruel and unusual punishment because juveniles are less, their brains are less developed.
Yeah.
Or their behavior is less developed. So the court didn't endorse the neuroscience exactly, but it mentioned it. It then held that you couldn't sentence juveniles to life without possibility of parole for non-homicide crimes they committed before they were 16. And again, cited some of the neuroscience literature about brain development. They're currently hearing a case about sentencing people to life without possibility of parole for homicides they committed when they were 14 or younger. And the neuroscience is getting used there. The broader issue of your responsibility is the one that people focus on a lot in law and neuroscience. I think it will play some role. I'm not convinced it'll play a huge role, but defense counsel are already trying to use it to mitigate sentences or mitigate responsibility in some cases. So I have neuroscience friends who think that neuroscience will make the criminal justice system disappear. That neuroscientists will convince us all that we have no free will, and so the SOB who mugged us had no free will, and since he had no free will, it wouldn't be right to punish him. I don't know any lawyers who believe that.
Well, why don't we just punish them and say we couldn't help it?
Well, in fact, I'm not sure that we can help believing that we have free will. We may not have free will to believe that we don't have free will. But I think the strong form doesn't work, in part because we punish people for all sorts of reasons, not just because they're bad people, but to deter them, to deter other people, just to incapacitate them, to lock them up so they can't hurt people other than other prisoners, or even sometimes, we hope, to rehabilitate them. And all those exist even if there's no free will.
Well, some of the people I've talked to who you just referred to indicate to me that they don't believe that people should be taken, people should not be taken out of the population.
Right.
They think for the safety of the society, they should be put in jail or someplace to separate them, but that punishment isn't going to change them in any way.
Right. It becomes a shift, I think, from thinking of it as punishment to thinking of it as treatment or involuntary commitment. You can take someone who's suicidal and commit them to a mental hospital for their own safety, or take somebody who is homicidal, insane and homicidal, dangerous to others, and civilly commit them. You're not saying that they're guilty or a criminal,
or a bad person,
but for their safety and the safety of others, you commit them. And it could be that we'll see some shift that way. And I do think there will be some cases where we see that shift. How many of them isn't clear to me.
The thing is, will something helpful to society get done by this shift in the way we view them?
So I think only if we actually come up with decent treatments.
Decent treatments.
Yeah. Only if we can figure out a way to intervene to make people less likely to commit crimes will something, I think, very valuable come out of this. And that something might be surgery, it might be drugs, it might be deep brain stimulation, it might be cognitive behavioral therapy, it might be arts and crafts. I don't know what it would be. The one thing we know is our current prison system is terrible at that. So if you look at the safety and efficacy of a neuroscience intervention, it could scarcely be worse than prison as a way of getting people to reform.
Do you suppose there's a gap between knowing that somebody has a likelihood of behaving badly and knowing what to do about that? Isn't there some kind of a disconnect there at the moment anyway?
It's one of the most frustrating things about all of biomedicine right now. We're learning so much more about why things go wrong. And you would think once you've learned why things go wrong, it's an easy step to figure out how to fix it. But it turns out to be a really hard step. I see this a lot in one of my other fields in genetics. We know a lot about genetic causes of diseases, but there are very few of them that we can treat at this point. The hope is, of course, and the explosion in neuroscience is coming as a result of an explosion of funding. That funding is not coming from the Department of Justice, it's coming from the National Institutes of Health. All of this knowledge is coming from money that's being spent to try to figure out how to prevent or cure or treat terrible diseases. We have to hope that it will work to some extent. I think it will. One thing I'm sure about is it will be slower and more arduous than we would like. But ultimately, if we can say, this person's criminal behavior, this person's bad behavior is a result of this brain problem, and here is a way we can fix or mitigate this brain problem, that's, I think, the long-term payoff. Mm-hmm. Although that does raise questions about, can you force somebody to accept brain-changing treatment?
Right, right. And how about this? Can you decide to go into somebody's head and derive what you say is real information about the condition they're in?
Yeah.
That's predictive. And is that not some kind of violation of privacy?
Yeah. So that's an area that I think will be particularly interesting and important with law. The extent to which we will be able to, and then we will allow ourselves to read people's minds. Mm. So people talk a lot about the responsibility issues in terms of how neuroscience will affect law. I actually think it'll probably have a bigger effect in terms of evidence of state of mind for things like lie detection. Or actually, the one that I would put my money on as being first to make it to the courts successfully will be pain detection. You know, that hurts, feels like it hurts here, but it actually hurts up here. Pain.
What does that have to do with justice? That's interesting.
Well, listen.
Yeah.
Pain is a huge problem in the American legal system. Think about, you rear end somebody, he claims he's got whiplash and back pain as a result. There are not very good physical ways to determine whether somebody truly has back pain or not,
yes,
or neck pain. This is an issue with auto accidents. It's a huge issue with Social Security disability determinations. Hundreds of thousands of people every year retire because of chronic pain. I think most of them are telling the truth. Some of them aren't. We can't really tell the difference, but there are people, there are neuroscientists who think they can see with an MRI the signature of pain in your brain, if you believe, as the neuroscientists do and as I've been forced to, that all of our subjective mental experience is produced by physical changes in our brain. And if you can then start seeing those physical changes in the brain, you can correlate physical brain state with subjective mental state. And you can say, every time we see somebody whose physical brain looks like this, we think they're having the experience of pain. That revolutionizes hundreds of thousands of lawsuits every year in the United States.
And you think we're close to that?
I think we're close to that. I think we'll see that within the next 5 to 10 years. Lie detection, I think, is a little farther off.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you about lie detection.
There are 2 companies that are selling the service. One is called CFOS, and one has the wonderful name of No Lie MRI. I mean, you can't make that sort of stuff up, right? They'll take $4,000 or $5,000. They'll put you in a scanner. They'll ask you questions on a subject you said you wanted to be questioned about, and they'll tell you whether they think you were telling the truth or not. And if you like the answer, they'll give you a nice big report. And if you don't like the answer, they won't. They'll keep your money one way or the other. This is actually...
Tell me how that works, just at that
Sure.
point. If you take the test and you don't like the answer, that is to say, you can't use it in court to your advantage.
Right. Or use it with your spouse, or use it with your employer.
Yes, that is very common, I understand, that you didn't want to prove to your spouse that you weren't having an affair or something like that. So do you get an oral report from the service, or do you get it in writing? And if you get it in writing, don't you have to present that in discovery?
It depends. Unfortunately, those are the first 2 words of every lawyer's honest answer to any question. Usually it will be presented in writing. Whether or not you have to present it in court depends on how it was acquired. So it might be viewed as attorney work product if your attorney ordered it, and it could be protected from discovery that way. It's an inside baseball issue, but there are ways to set it up to try to protect it.
But can you get as many of these tests as you want until you get one you like?
Until you run out of money.
And could that one be used in court to the exclusion of the others?
Well, but you would have to answer questions about.
Yeah. Did you take any other tests?
Before?
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
And what were those results?
Yeah. So go ahead. I interrupted you on the path.
But this isn't voodoo. There really are 30 or 40 now peer-reviewed published articles showing that you can, with 85, 80, 90% accuracy, tell whether somebody's telling the truth or not. That's a lot. That's more evidence than we've got for polygraphs. And although polygraphs aren't admissible in most courts, they're still used pretty widely. There's some problems, though. Not every one of the papers finds the same brain areas involved. So that's a bit of a problem. You know, paper A says it's this area and paper B says it's that area. That causes some difficulty in terms of what we understand. But I think the deeper problems are, these are studies conducted as controlled experiments, usually with undergrads. The no-lie MRI study is based on 4 right-handed male University of Pennsylvania undergrads who said they'd never used drugs. So we know they're lying to begin with. And they know it's an experiment.
Right.
They've signed a consent form. They know they're not going to get in trouble. And are they lying when the investigator says, when you see the 8 of spades, say that you don't see it?
Yeah.
They're following orders.
Yeah.
Is that the same as when somebody on the stand says, no, I never tried to buy cocaine from that undercover officer? Or is it the same? Actually, I shouldn't say this. This may show up on TV. So don't use this. Is it the same when I say every Thanksgiving to my mother, no, the turkey wasn't too dry, it was perfect? Is it the same when you say to somebody, no, that tie works perfectly?
Yeah.
That dress doesn't make you look fat. Don't use that one either. It's a little intimidating when you think that my wife or my mother might actually see this.
Well, this is interesting. You bring up an interesting question. Are there degrees of white lie detection and serious lie detection?
And we don't know the answer. It could be that the same brain signals that you get in the experiment happen when people are lying in real life. But it could be that there aren't. And until we get good experiments in a real life, realistic setting, we won't know the answer. The problem is, it's hard to do those experiments.
Yeah.
My IRB, my University Ethics Committee, won't let me go into dorm rooms and arrest undergrads and accuse them of crimes and have them really think that they'll go to jail unless they convincingly lie. So setting up the experiments is difficult. But I think that's one of the biggest problems with lie detection, that the experiments are not what we call ecologically realistic. And that's how science works. Controlled experiments, you try to eliminate as many variables as you can. The problem is, the more variables you eliminate, the less it looks like the real world, and the less confident you can be that your result will happen. It will be the same as a real world result.
Has anybody ever tested people while they were playing poker? There you have a real world situation.
Not with fMRI. That would be interesting.
Well, maybe with an MEG.
Yeah, or maybe the problem, EEG, there is some lie detection work being done with EEGs, which is probably the easiest one to do. Although, again, it's kind of interesting. It's not lie detection exactly. In that case, it's recognition detection. So if they show a suspect pictures of the crime scene that only the suspect would have seen, and his brain signals that, gosh, I've seen that before, it's effectively lie detection. You're not actually looking, you're not even having him answer a question, you're just showing him pictures. It's used effectively as lie detection, but what you're really looking at is recognition. Just as the pain detection, usually if I want to know whether somebody's feeling pain, the best way to find out is to ask them. But in situations where you're not confident they'll tell you the truth, then pain detection becomes effectively a lie detection technique.
What about the whole question of whether or not it's fair to go into somebody's mind and not simply take testimony?
I think this is going to be one we're going to have to grapple with. I mean, it is the case right now that I'm trying to read your mind. I'm looking at your facial expressions, I'm looking at your body language, I'm trying to figure out whether you like what I'm saying, whether you understand what I'm saying, We read minds all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's a strong survival trait.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be evolutionarily selected. It's been a long time since lions and tigers and bears were our biggest worry. It's other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this guy going to share food with me, or is he going to hit me? Mm-hmm. And the people who can't do that are seriously disabled. One of the problems for many people with autism is they don't have a theory of mind. They don't seem to be able to emotionally grasp what's going on in other people's minds. So we read minds all the time. We just know we're not very good at it. Mm-hmm. Is it different to try to read a mind with a machine than to try to read a mind by looking at a face? It's different if it's more effective, I suppose. Where should we stop? Could I get a search warrant to say...
I want to search your brain.
Yeah, well, look, I can get if I've got probable cause, I can get a judge, if I show a judge probable cause, he can give me a warrant to search your house for evidence of a crime.
Yeah.
What if I can say I have probable cause to believe that Alda's mind contains evidence of a crime? Can I get a search warrant to search it?
So what do you now?
We don't know the answer to
now
that.
Switch hats and be the legal scholar and tell me what the chances are of that happening in the near future.
I think I think we'll have some interesting court cases. We're still a little far from the technology being good enough for somebody being willing to try it. Mm-hmm. And it will take an aggressive prosecutor to try it, because it'll be, to say the least, politically unsettling. Mm-hmm. But the country's got a lot of prosecutors, and some of them are aggressive. Mm-hmm. And you get a serious enough crime, or, of course, take it out of the criminal justice system and think about counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. We may have already been using it. One thing we know is the CIA and the intelligence community and the Defense Department are all spending lots of money on neuroscience research. Those of us in the field just aren't sure what they're spending the money on because it's classified. Will somebody try that? I think within the next 10 years, somebody will try to get a warrant to do a mental search. Will a court grant it? Probably not, but it will take making some new law. The Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, they don't fit very easily. People weren't thinking about this in 1789. I think they will say that the Fifth Amendment limits you from looking at some aspects of the mind, but the Fifth Amendment, your privilege against self-incrimination, doesn't prevent the police from taking a blood sample to see if you're intoxicated. Doesn't prevent them from taking an X-ray to see if you've got a bullet in your chest, as the culprit supposedly had. Those are physical things. Well, if I put you in a scanner, all I'm looking at is physical things. Yeah. I'm looking at patterns of blood flow in your brain. Is that more like a breathalyzer? Or is it more like putting you on the stand and asking you a question? Yeah. There have already been several articles written about this. The best one is Nita Farahani's article called Incriminating Thoughts. But we don't know what the courts will do, and it will be interesting. My own guess is the Constitution is not likely to be enough. The Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the First Amendment, all can be argued to give some protection, but not as much protection as I think we will want. I think we will probably want, ultimately, statutory protections for our mental freedom, to keep people from being able to force us to reveal the insides of our brain.
Do you think, as someone who's interested in the best justice system we can have, that it is in society's interest to be protected against an invasion of our thoughts?
And you can argue that both ways.
Well, but how would you fall on that?
I feel very strongly both ways.
It depends.
I mean, it depends. I do see the arguments in both directions. I'm not opposed to prosecution. I think getting dangerous people off the streets is a really good thing. At the same time, I wouldn't want somebody to be able, with a warrant, to put me in a scanner and ask me questions and see my answer. I think the ability to lie or to say no is a useful thing in our society. And no, Laura, I'm not talking about you, or not talking about lying to you. I think that it's there are values there, and we need to protect them. We haven't had to protect them because our methods of mind reading haven't been that good. And they aren't that good now, but they're getting better. Jack Gallant from Berkeley has done amazing work being able to reconstruct what somebody's seeing by their brainwaves. Now, that's what they're seeing. That's not deeply exciting, but it's the same, not by their brainwaves, by their brain scans. But it's the same kind of technology that should be able to correlate. Imagine, a dictator in a faraway country putting his people in a scanner and showing them pictures of himself and pictures of the enemy, and deciding by looking at brain scans whether they liked him better or they liked the enemy better. That could happen. That is, to some extent, kind of happening already with neuromarketing. There are firms that are putting consumers that are basically doing focus groups in scanners, or putting consumers in scanners to see whether they really like Coke better than Pepsi or Pepsi better than Coke. Looking for likes shouldn't be that hard. Everything in the brain is complicated, and nothing is likely to be 100%. But in the not very distant future, to be able to show people images in a scanner and decide what their emotional reaction is to those images should be feasible.
So are they putting candidates' pictures in scanners now?
Well, you know, there was a terrible story in the New York Times with the last election cycle that did just that. It made it to the front page of the Sunday News and Review section, and it showed pictures of McCain and Obama and Clinton and Edwards and somebody else. And in a very, I thought, and my neuroscience friends thought, scientifically naive way, said, aha, the amygdala is activated here, and the amygdala is involved in fear, and therefore people are worried about Obama. Or the insula is involved here when they see Edwards, and the insula is involved in disgust, and therefore they're disgusted with John Edwards before they actually knew enough to be disgusted with John Edwards. I supported that man.
You paid some high hotel bills.
Yeah. So people have already tried to do that. The science really didn't justify what they were doing yet, but it will soon. And then we'll have to grapple with that. And you know, it's not even as easy as just saying, can we stop people from being forced to do this? What happens if we allow lie detection but only voluntarily? So you volunteer for lie detection. You and I are both suspected of something. You volunteer for it, I don't. What does that say about me? To the police, to the district attorney, and maybe, if you're allowed to comment on it, ultimately to the jury. So even voluntary uses can impose some pressure, some involuntary pressure on other people who don't want to use it to allow it to be used.
How far off do you think we are from scanning and reading the brain and making predictions, all the things we've been talking about, actually coming into the courtroom one way or another?
Two cases in May of 2010 involved efforts to introduce lie detection fMRI evidence into court. In both of those cases, the judges refused to let it in, but those companies will keep trying. I think we'll probably see pain detection testimony in court within the next 5 years. We already are seeing in criminal cases people fairly regularly now, criminal defense counsel introducing brain scans of their clients and trying to say, look, my guy has a hole in his frontal lobe. That means he shouldn't be held responsible. They're almost always losing, but they're not always losing. So to some extent, it's already here. It's going to get here more and more, and I think within the next, by 10 years from now, I'll be very surprised if there isn't a substantial amount of neuroscience evidence getting into courts.
Is that at first going to be a good thing, or is it going to be disruptive?
Yes. It will be a good thing to some extent, it'll be a bad thing to some extent. It's like, you know, all technologies can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. One of the things we really have to worry about is our desire for a quick fix. So I think we tend to rush into things thinking it's going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then it turns out it's not so good.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of tight regulation before we start using something. Be convinced that we know how well it works. Something sort of like the FDA system for drugs to prove that something is safe and effective.
Does such a thing exist?
No, not for, say, a mind reading use, a lie detection use, or a pain detection use. The FDA has to be convinced that an MRI machine is safe and effective, but it doesn't have to be convinced that using an MRI to do lie detection is safe and effective.
Well, that sounds like something that legal scholars ought to be working on, people with experience in both areas.
And that's something that I've been arguing for a while. It's an uphill fight. I think oftentimes to get legislation passed, you need a scandal, unfortunately. You know, we tend to be reactive rather than foresighted.
Yeah.
In part because, you know, you've got companies trying to sell this and they have an interest in not being regulated unless they're forced to. It'll take something, some event, I'm afraid, before we realize we have to be very careful about how good this is before we start using it. You know, there's a great example from our not too distant history. 1948, a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz won the Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology for inventing a procedure to treat mental illness that he didn't, but other people called the prefrontal lobotomy. That got the Nobel Prize.
I didn't know that.
20 years later, it was abandoned as barbaric and awful. I don't think it was ever quite as good as it was portrayed, and actually I don't think it was quite as barbaric under the circumstances as it was subsequently portrayed. But it was not a good thing. 30,000 Americans got lobotomies because it looked like a nice, quick fix. And I'm sure that some of those people, you know, it was a 20-year-old boy who was arrested for something, and a DA said to the parents, you know, we've always known that Jimmy's not quite right. There's this new procedure. Tell you what, if he gets this procedure, we won't charge him. I'm sure that, I don't have a case, but I'm sure that sort of thing happened. We rushed into it, and people were damaged as a result. So, you know, I think that the first question, does it work? How well does it work? How well do we know it works? That's crucial, and we don't pay enough attention to that.
What's happening, if anything, to bring about some kind of review like that as a normal matter of course?
Not enough. You know, we've got an advantage in terms of courtrooms because their judges have to reach a conclusion that scientific evidence is valid. And there are a variety of legal rules about that, and there is a judge as gatekeeper. But there's nothing like that for investigators. If a defendant wants to say, if a suspect wants to say, here, look at my fMRI brain scan, don't charge me. We've got no regulation for that. We've got no regulation if a parent wants to send their kid off to be lie detected. There's nothing that limits that. We need to worry about it more. One of the problems in our system is when there's an opportunity to make money. And the people who have a chance to make money off of it often are not eager to embrace regulation. So I think we need to pay more attention to, does this stuff work before we let it get out into society? And it's, you know, I love my neuroscience friends. They're brilliant people, they're doing important stuff, they're doing moral stuff, they're doing it for good reasons. More of them need to remember that what they create might not always be used for good reasons and might not always be used the ways they want it to be used.
What difference would it make if they remember that?
How
would they act on that?
I would like to see them speak out more. And some of them do.
Speak out in what way?
Speak out publicly, speak out to the media, speak out to Congress, speak out to others saying, look, this is great research. I'm very proud of the research I've done. It's not ready to be used in general. It needs more testing. We need to think about it. We need to have a debate about it. I'm actually one of the founders of a group called the International Neuroethics Society, a nonprofit scholarly organization. And we have quite a few neuroscientists as well as ethicists and lawyers involved in it. People who are worried, and I do think there are quite a few neuroscientists who are concerned about how their work might be misused. I just wish there were more. and that they had more opportunities to get their point of view across.
Right. Can I get practical for a second?
Sure.
Even more practical than you've been so far.
You can do anything you want. It's your camera.
In our program,
It's your camera.
in our program, we have a case that goes to court, and it's a fictional case.
Right.
A young man who's just turning 18, and at his birthday party, his friends give him cocaine, that he's had cocaine previously. They give it to him again. And they encourage him to come with them to rob a convenience store, and they give him a gun, and he carries a gun into the store. And there's a lot of noise going on, a lot of yelling, and he's holding the gun on the clerk, and somebody comes through a door, and he turns quickly and fires, and it's the clerk's wife. It wounds her in the head. She's severely wounded. This story was constructed so that you'd have a chance to bring to bear a lot of different kinds of neuroscience research.
Right.
On different aspects of it. What about the boy, about how a jury decides what's going through their heads when they're making decisions of this kind, what's going through the judge's head, and they don't always seem to correspond. Possibly because there's a different kind of experience on the judge's part. But in any case, what do you think, based on what you understand about neuroscience, today would happen or could be brought to bear in this case in the court during the process?
So first, I think almost nothing useful would be done purely with neuroscience. You'd be taking behavioral evidence about how the kid acts and adding neuroscience to that. The neuroscience would be combined with behavioral evidence. I'd look for evidence of immaturity. I'd look for it in terms of his behavior, but then if I were his defense counsel and the brain scan showed something unusual, limited amount of myelinization in the prefrontal lobes, I'd try to argue, look, he shouldn't be held as responsible because his brain's not as fully developed.
Well, let me ask you right there. He's just turned 18. Does the judge have the ability to ignore the fact that the law says he should be tried as an adult?
Probably not. But the jury might, if presented with several different levels of crime, so it sounds like the wife didn't die or hasn't died. If she had died, you might worry about, well, is it murder 1, is it murder 2, is it murder 3? All of which might allow the jury some discretion, either legitimate discretion or the discretion the jury exercises one way or the other, without necessarily having the legal power to exercise it, to say, he's a very young 18. His brain is a very young 18. We shouldn't go quite so hard on him. Would that be the right legal answer? Maybe yes, maybe no. But juries, one of the reasons we have a jury system is to incorporate issues of community views of justice that aren't necessarily quite the same as the rigid letter of the law.
It sounds like you would have to educate the jury about what myelination is.
Yeah.
And what kind of an effect it has.
So you'd want to find an expert witness who projected very well, who spoke very well. In the long run, the scientists, a clue to seeing what kind of scientists communicate well with real people might be looking to see what the best expert witnesses are like and what they do in order to communicate to real people. It's a very hard job to be an expert witness. Scientists find it very unpleasant and difficult because they're not allowed to just explain. They have to answer specific questions. But I think that would be something you would try. It's conceivable, although I wouldn't think it would work today. It's conceivable you could try some lie detection. So you could ask the kid, did you plan this? Did you think about it? And try to get answers to that and see if the court would let that in. Ultimately, if he were convicted, you would look to see if there were anything the neuroscience could add about his likelihood of committing the crime again that might be useful on either sentencing him or deciding. A huge area of the the punishment world that is invisible to most of us is the decision about what prison somebody goes to, which can be a really important decision for their life. And you'd make that decision based in part on dangerousness and so on. Well, neuroscience may be able to contribute a little bit to that. Or is there a rehabilitation method? Is there some sort of training or treatment that might help him make better decisions in the future? I don't think we're at a stage where neuroscience can tell us yes or no today, but in the near future it might be able to help give us clues about how to treat this kid in a way that will minimize the chances he'll do something like this again.
So is it a good thing or a bad thing, a scary thing, that we're getting more and more neuroscience in the court?
You know what you want me to say? It
I
depends.
That's what I want you to say, because that's what you like to say.
It depends.
Yeah.
I think it can be a good thing. I think it should be a good thing. There will be good uses from it. I'm an academic. I'm biased in favor of knowledge.
Yeah.
I think knowledge is good and more knowledge is better. But that doesn't mean that it can't be misused. We have to be vigilant against its misuse. Every technology I know of can be used for good purposes or bad purposes, can be used well, it can be used sloppily. We need to make sure, as far as we can, and we won't be perfect at it, that we use this technology only when we know it works, in a way that we know will work, and for reasons that we accept and that we think are good purposes for using these new technologies. If we can do that, or even come close to doing that, this will be a good thing. This could revolutionize in a good way the justice system.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.